when I got out of prison for doing a plowshares, I hammered on a B-52 at Griffiths Air Force Base with Liz McAllister and several others. Mm-hmm. And we got 2 years in prison for that.
In 1983?
Yeah, that was 1983. And I'd gone to Seneca early, 1983. And then I never thought about it until just a moment ago, but after Seneca, I also went to Greenham Common. I mean, what an impact. And also Fast Lane, they were starting Fast Lane, but Greenham Common too. And then before I hammered on the B-52, I was at the Pentagon, and I had been there for a big march on El Salvador also, and I was all over the East Coast at those days. There was so much going on in the early 80s. And so I went to the Pentagon for this demonstration, and while I was there, I realized that, they won't talk to you. There were thousands of us there, and it was so threatening for people working in the Pentagon and the soldiers. I mean, they march right by you like you're invisible. And there was the Women's Pentagon Action. I did some of those. So I decided I was going to go back to the Pentagon, and I had first arrived. I'd gone from New York City at the Catholic Worker. I was with the Catholic Worker movement. And so I thought, I got to go back to the Pentagon. I got to go back. And it was the first time I had been at the Pentagon, being at the Catholic Worker and living and working on the Bowery and watching people suffer from exposure and you name it, and the homelessness. Where I lived, they admitted to 36,000 people living on the street on any given night. That's just what they had admitted to. And I would often cry and cry and cry, 'cause you get tired. There was violence everywhere. Bless you. And one night, I was again crying, and I realized that I could no longer even have the privilege of having this bed. That I needed to, we didn't have much at the Worker, and I lived in a dorm, but I realized that I had to go out and start crying in places where injustice stems from. So, and this is after the peace encampment, but I went to the Pentagon by myself. I stopped in Baltimore first to visit Phil Berrigan and Liz and tell them what I was doing. I was a little tentative, but I wanted to talk to the people at the Pentagon. I wanted them to know about the homeless and why I had been there that day protesting, and of course Central America. And so I took the local train to the Pentagon and got off, and at that time there was the concourse inside the Pentagon. The public could still be there. And like one thing we did in the concourse of the Pentagon, we let chickens loose one day and yelled, "The sky is falling." The creativity of the peace movement. But I went and I pulled a piece of cardboard out of the trash, and I wrote on the cardboard, "It is a sin to build a nuclear weapon." And a lot of influence with the Catholic Worker too, of course. And so I went out to the steps, and the first people to come out were some of the guards who were both African American, and they said, what are you doing here? And I said, I'm not here to cause any trouble. And I didn't sit, I didn't plant myself in a certain way. I was off to the side with a little sign, and I just wanted to sit for a few days. And I was knitting, and I had my sign and fasting. And so I told them, I'm just here just to do this, and then I'll leave. And they let me stay. And it was the most amazing thing. And to be alone and so vulnerable in such a place, there's such power in that too, in numbers, but even an individual, And so I sat on the steps, and I had a sleeping bag, and I would go to the bathroom inside. And so the first night, I was on the stone steps, and it was pretty quiet, but in the morning when the generals and everybody starts coming, I mean, it's thousands and thousands and thousands of people coming to the place. And some of them were walking by me and taking double takes, and I was just quietly there, and I'd get different reactions from different people. And as the days went by, because it was a total of 3 days and like 4 nights, and as the days went by, people felt they were getting to know me a little or became familiar, and then you kind of merged together. And some people would stop and say, what are you doing here? And I'd tell them about the homeless and the connection with the bomb. And I would talk to them about where I was from, and they would tell me a little bit. And some of the generals were the nicest. Some were nasty, but some of them with all the stars, they were the very nicest. They didn't feel threatened at all. And they'd come by and they'd say, "Oh, you'd make a good soldier if you're on the right side," and we'd laugh, and I'd laugh, and it was also them acknowledging to me, wow, and saying, well, I respect you for doing this, and you're a little crazy. And then they would try to have discussions with me, and they would talk about the bomb, and I would talk about peace. And there's so many instances. There was one man who came out of the Pentagon one day, and he was a born-again preacher. And he was interested in getting the contract. He had been inside the Pentagon because he wanted the contract for the Exocet missile, which was the missile used in the Falklands that was so successful.
Say again, he was a born-again...
He's born-again preacher. Born-again Christian, but he also wanted the contract for these weapons. He was involved in the weapons industry. In the Falkland Islands, they used the Exocet, and it was quite a good bomb, I guess, in their eyes. But he came by, and he saw the sign that said it's a sin to build a nuclear weapon, and he looked at it. So he came back to me, and he said, he started having a discussion with me about the bomb and telling me I want to be the contractor. I went in to bid on this and blah, blah, blah. And he said to me toward the end, he said, well, he said, I think that God dropped a bomb on Sodom and Gomorrah, and that's why we have the Dead Sea. And this is a man who really believed that and wanted to develop the missiles. There were soldiers who would wake me up in the middle of the night. There was one fellow in particular, the first night I was there, he yelled at me, "What do you think this is, some kind of joke?" And I'm on the stone, and I look up and go, "No, not really." And he went on in, and it's a pretty quiet night, but the people come and go there all hours of the day. They even do a lot of praying in the Pentagon. I've met Billy Graham twice coming out of the Pentagon, and there's never a war he didn't support. My feelings about him. But the next night this young soldier came back, and he said, "You're still here," and he started yelling at me. And he was irrational, but he came with a few friends who also were going to work, and they kind of hung around, and he had his say and went back in the building. And the next morning he came out, and he said, I'm sorry. He said, "I've just broken up with my wife. I'm really not in a good way." And I said, "It's okay." I said, "I'm just here to listen." And he burst out crying and would share with me. And I had the sense that a lot of these folks were really miserable and just going to work. There were a few who really, really believed in what they were doing. There was one officer who would walk by me every day, and I could feel him. And he hated me. I could feel it, and it was so tangible. And he'd never said anything to me, and he'd walk by and he'd, just typed. And I'd say to him, "I'm not invisible. I'm not invisible," because they so often treat you like you're invisible. So the very last day I was on the steps, he came by, and he finally thought of the most horrible thing he could say to me. And I'd been fasting. They didn't know that, but you're so vulnerable. And he said to me, "It's a sin to be a glutton." And I remember him looking down at me, and I'm looking up at him, and then the tears just started running down my face. It was such a hateful, nothing really, but after that, one of my favorite military officer guys came by, and he sees me weeping, and he says, "Oh," he said, "is this your last day? Are you going?" He said, don't worry," and I said, "Oh, please let me inside. I'd love to sit down and talk to a few of you and really speak with you about these weapons." And I said, "It's not so much my fear of the bombs dropping, but the people who are dropping now without homes and dying in the streets." And he fudged, and it struck him. You could see him struggle. And finally he said to me, he said, "Listen, honey," he said, "there's 36,000 people who work in here, and we all know you're out there. We all know you're out here." And it was his way of acknowledging, and so I think my time at the peace encampment was brief, but had a huge impact on me. And I had gone with a community from the Catholic Worker
To the encampment?
to the encampment. I brought Dean Maurer with me, who she would have written about this for the Catholic Worker newsletter years back, and she was elderly and blind and feisty, and so I accompanied her and came to the encampment. And I have to say, I never, my road or journey to being a feminist was just a result of being in all these wonderful places and meeting all these wonderful people, because I was concerned about the homeless and poverty and all sorts of things. And it's feminism didn't enter my mind too much. Plus, there's the whole Catholic bullshit. In fact, they're going to close my parish soon, and I want to march on the Chancery and do the last rites for them. But
I like that.
yeah. So being a person of faith, it took me a long time to come to the feminism and to break out of all those molds and patterns, and it just happened. And so when I went to the peace encampment, I was outside my comfort zone. My eyes were wide open. It was beautiful, but I couldn't see enough. I saw women with beards and mustaches, and that made a big impression. And the camping, the roughness, the meetings. Ruth talked about consensus. Well, coming from the Catholic Worker in community and meetings, it was like, oh no, I know I can't do this. But I was fascinated by the women and very moved by the dedication and their being there, And I thought of this quote of Dan Berrigan's, and I don't know if you knew the Berrigans are from here in Syracuse, but Dan had said once that there's this saying, "Don't just stand there, do something." He says, "Don't just do something, stand there." And he always plays with these words, and I thought about, wow, all these women standing there and doing something. And I did get arrested years later, and this would have been after the plowshares. But when I was there that first time in '83, we marched. Didn't we all march a long ways? Well, quite a long ways, not really, but through the town. I remember the guy with the gun. I saw the rifle. There was a guy who was drunk in town, and the police were around, but this guy was threatening to shoot us. And
So that would have been the march from Seneca Falls to the encampment,
yeah,
probably.
yeah. And was that '83?
That was
Yeah, because I have a tendency to mix up time. So I was thinking, and he had this rifle, and he was really drunk. And I'm kind of used to drunk guys coming from the Catholic Worker, but this gun thing, and I couldn't believe my eyes. And the police kind of defused it, and some of the women and the peacekeepers were there, and it was a little frightening. But what I saw is the police empty the chamber of the rifle. And in the paper the next day, it was reported that there were no bullets in the gun. But I saw these shells. And then as we marched through town, I had to laugh at this one guy, and big sign that said, "Nuke 'em till they glow, then shoot 'em in the dark." I thought that was pretty clever. And then we marched on to Seneca. And I didn't get arrested that year because I was with Dean and she couldn't get over the fence. And we were going to try to get under the fence and the police kind of stopped us. But from there, I went back to the Catholic Worker and this and that, and I ended up at the Greenham Common. I got a chance. I got a grant to visit with the peace community through Great Britain. So I was in Ireland in the north and Scotland, but the Greenham Common
What do you remember about Greenham?
I remember how rough it was. I remember a newborn baby who was birthed at the Greenham Common. I saw, the rain. Every time I was at Seneca, it was a beautiful sunny day. It was never in the winter. I'm sure you had different experiences, but the pouring rain all the time and the cooking outside, and they didn't have many structures because the military would come out and take them down. And so they'd be trying to cook right in the rain. And once in a while they'd get a structure up in a little tent and they'd stay for a while before it got taken down. But these women, they were long haul. And I didn't get to know any of the women at the Seneca depot, Army Depot, quite like I did these women because I stayed a few days. And the beauty and the courage, but the hardness. We might want to talk about the romance and the good times and the good years compared to now, but this was rough, rough stuff. But still there was the humor and love, peace, and I often think about activism now as not in civil disobedience, called civil obedience, but I tell people now I don't break the law, I commit art. I'm committing art because visuals, like the webs being woven, the beautiful signs. And I always, when we went to Fort Benning this time, when I got a felony with my friends, the sign that said "Welcome to Fort Benning," and it said "Home of School of America." The sign that we went to at Fort Benning said "Home of Fort Benning," and then it had military installation, tall pine trees behind it. It was like a big set, and on the sign I had made some stencils, and there were 5 of us, including a priest and a nun, and I had gotten the pictures from the murdered Jesuits and the 2 church women in El Salvador, and from the actual crime scene, and blown them up, and they were there. And you know about the School of the Americas, right? Yeah. And so on the sign we stenciled "Home of School of America, School of Shame, SOA equals torture." And we had people in the trees chained to deer stands. And one of them was Charlie Litke, who won the Congressional Medal of Honor. So he was up in one tree. And it was like "No war, no more, pause," and coming down the banners and the pictures of the Jesuits and just speaking the truth to power. And these were letters that just the stencils would wash right off, and they came while they were still processing us out there. They came with the hoses, and when the red letters came off, it was like river of blood just washing all over. And I'd gotten a felony for that, and I also had ashes with me, or dirt from me, from the mass graves in Panama. So I'm forgetting my point but in terms of art, the visuals and the creativity and everything that people bring, it's such a powerful. And think about Cindy Sheehan and just showing up in a tent in a gutter, that what's going to be the next step.
Can you tell us, for the sake of the project, talk about School of Americas, describe it for people that won't know what it is?
The School of the Americas, briefly I can say, it's a school that used to be in Panama, and it got kicked out of Panama. They also called it, its nickname was the School of Assassins. And when it got kicked out of Panama, they brought it to Fort Benning. It's really not part of Fort Benning, but it's located at Fort Benning, and it's like from the Cold War era, this whole mindset, and these folks, they who run the school, they bring in foreign military from mostly Central and South America. Now they do it at so many of the bases from all over the world. We're training murderers and supporting them and arming them. So at Fort Benning is the School of the Americas, and even the soldiers who are stationed at Fort Benning and going to doing training there were when they would learn about the School of the Americas, and we would meet them out in the bars and stuff aside from protesting, and they would be horrified by this place. They wouldn't believe it, and they never heard of it, but here's this school of assassins, right there, and they're responsible for training many mass murderers and despots and arming. I mean, we do the dirty work. And I had been to Panama on the first anniversary of the invasion, and Ramsey Clark was there, and I was with a few others, and went to some of the mass graves in Panama. And so I brought that little bit of dirt with me to the School of the Americas. And when I was giving testimony during my trial, we were introducing evidence, but one of the things that was lost was this little piece of pottery with the dirt from the mass graves. And I remarked during the trial that how appropriate that was, that this pottery piece was lost, just like so many people who had been missing. And I did closing arguments for our trial, and I talked with the jury, and this is a story I carry with me, if I can say it now. I carry it with me in so many places, and it so applies to all of us. And it's a parable, and it talks about these women. And there's a parable of this small village, and every day the women would go to the river to wash their clothes. And I'm simplifying this a little bit, but one day the women went to the river and they saw a child floating in the river, and they jumped in, of course, to save the baby. And the next day at the river there were a few more children, and they jumped in the river, and the next day there were more children and more, and this went on for a long time. And then the whole town got involved, the whole village got involved, and they were doing classes of like how to rescue. They were organizing for food for the children and the infants, for clothing, for nursing, and they were trying to organize around this phenomenon of these children floating and dying in the river. And every day these women would jump in. And one day, after months of this, they were at the river once again, and in they go to the river. There were several women, and they could only do the best they could. They could only save so many, but every day they were there. They jumped in the river and started swimming out, and there's one woman who didn't. And they looked back and they say, "What are you doing? Where are you going? Come on. Where are you going? We've got to save the children." And she says, "I'm going to walk upstream and find the bastard who's throwing them in." It's a parable that people can really connect to, and again, it was the women, and it was their heart, and it was their love of peace, and there just isn't enough of it in this world. And
can you tell us, again, for the sake of the archive, about Catholic Worker and what it means to be a part of that community and how you got involved?
I got involved with the Catholic Worker. I was doing some nursing as a very young person, and it was before I was 20. I ended up right around the age of 20 at the Catholic Worker in New York. I heard about it, but I really didn't know anything except that they needed some help with nursing. I really didn't understand. I was a product of my environment, and I had campaigned for Nixon in high school. I had never met a vegetarian or a hippie, ever, and I end up at the Catholic Worker.
What year are we talking then?
This would be 1971.
In New York City?
Yeah.
Okay.
And never. I mean, if you can imagine, and you go, and the Catholic Worker is it's a community. Dorothy Day was alive still. It was a shelter for homeless. It was a soup kitchen. It had volunteers living and working there. Nobody earned a salary. It's the Catholic Worker movement. And it's different in that, from a faith community perspective, it's based on simply on the works of mercy and doing the works of mercy, you know, clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, visiting the prisoner, burying the dead, you know, all these wonderful works of mercy, all these things we're asked to do as people of faith, and not just from one tradition either. But the difference with the Catholic Worker that I embraced once I figured it all out and did a 360, which was very painful, but was that the Catholic Worker also asked the question, why are they homeless? Why are they hungry? And so there's this very, very activist kind of, you know, once you start asking the questions and questioning in that way, you become very politicalized. And I remember I had a discussion with Mother Teresa, and she would come to the Worker from time to time, and Dorothy had this discussion with her. I'm sure mine was a little more unique, but I happened to be in her presence once, and she was a very controversial person around the Catholic Worker. And there's a book written about her by Christopher Hitchens, and it's called Missionary Position, which is very fresh, but very interesting book. And some of what he wrote about, I saw when she started opening up shelters in New York. I had questions. So anyway, at one point I said to Mother Teresa, you know, Jesus didn't go to jail because he was a nice guy. I said he was out there pissing him off. And she always speaks of being apolitical. And I was at the White House once, and she was inside having lunch with Ronald Reagan, and we were outside praying on the driveway for the homeless and being arrested. And I talked to her very briefly. I didn't get much time. I just said how embarrassed I was when she started opening up shelters in America, that she came from a third world country. We were a first world country, and why was she opening up shelters here? And I said, why didn't you sit with the president and tell him to take care of his own people? Because in the Reagan years, that's when everything went topsy-turvy in terms of the face of the homeless. It was, when I first got there, it was primarily derelicts and veterans and men from the road. But once Reagan came in, all of a sudden it was everybody, and it was women and children. And I'll never forget the first time I walked into the soup kitchen and there was a high chair. I was in Washington, Catholic Worker. A high chair in a soup kitchen in America. And I wondered, when did this become acceptable? It never used to be, and it was when our priorities changed as a government and more money into the military-industrial complex. The face of the homeless changed radically, and it was differently abled people, it was hurting people, people missing limbs, and elderly women. And I could not understand this or accept it. And in Christopher Hitchens' book, not that Mother Teresa isn't a great woman, I have very mixed feelings about her, but he spoke a lot about, at some length, you know, that a lot of the money that she got, it wasn't accounted for, and he felt that a lot of it was funneled, I think he more than thought, that a lot of it was funneled into the Vatican. He described the Pope as being the pimp and Mother Teresa the prostitute for the church. Very interesting. But the Catholic Worker is a life of never trying to live at an advantage, or that you stood with the poor, and when you stand with the poor and you hear their stories, then you realize, you know, that I certainly realized that they weren't bad people. Like I was grown up to believe. My mother would point to the poor and tell me if I wasn't a good girl. That's what would happen to me. And so I came to the Catholic Worker with all these attitudes, and in high school I graduated '69, and it was mandatory to take a course called Americanism versus Communism, and it was taught by the high school football coach. So anyway, I was so confused, and I ended up at the Catholic Worker, and my eyes were opened and continued to open. And then Seneca Army Depot, every step I took, everywhere, there was another whole world out there that I would step into. And when I got out of prison in '86, I came to Syracuse, and I did jail ministry downtown in our jail. So I came out of the prison experience wanting to do jail work. Well, our jail downtown, everybody's been in it. I mean, it's the little jail downtown, from the Griffiths Air Force Base, so many people arrested and in the jail. But I was working as jail ministry, and it's a Catholic Worker project, so we worked on justice issue. And it was a horrible jail, and there's no good jail, but it was particularly bad, and I'd been in many. And one day while I was working, I heard something. I was driving a bus of women prisoners to Attica, Wyoming, I was driving a bus of families of women in prison. And the bus I was driving was from the Catholic Charities. And anyway, the women often the families had a hard time visiting women in prison. And it was also long distances, bad weather, so we would do this bus. This little woman named Frances Briglin was in the front of the bus, and she says to me, and I'd been working in the jail several years at this point, she says, "Oh, I was just in the jail." And I go, "Frances, what happened?" And then she said, "You know what?" She said, "They hung me on the bars." And I go, "What?" And it was snowing, and I'm trying to keep my eyes on the road. I'm going, "What? They hung you on the bars?" But then she said something to me that struck me like nothing else. She said, "But I deserved it." She said, "I was drunk." And at that point, I went to myself. I said, "Oh my God, who else has this happened to? And we don't even know about it." So briefly, I started investigating, and what I learned was that they were hanging our prisoners naked on the bars, stretched out, and hanging for hours at a time, and they called it the Jesus Christ. And they were stretched with their arms back here and their feet out and chained, and so they were like swinging even. And so nobody would do anything, and I knocked on all the doors, and I've always been told by judges and prosecutors, there's a system in place, Miss Rumpf, you don't have to get arrested, there's a system in place. So I knocked on this door, I knocked on that door, I went here, I went there, the congressman, the sheriff, the county legislature, I was everywhere. Nobody gave a shit about, so, they either didn't believe me or didn't care. Even the people I worked with were like, "Are you sure about this?" And I was, because I saw the hands and I saw the scars and I had enough stories. And the people I worked with, they were so good, but they'd never been in jail, but they were such good people that they couldn't even believe that people they knew who worked in the jail for years now would be capable of this. So finally I built a cage. And again, here I was alone. I built a cage and moved it in front of the jail, and I had a sign on the cage that said low-income housing, because I knew they had used HUD monies to build some of these jails and prisons, which is true, HUD monies. And then I also had a picture of a woman I drew, and she was screaming, and it said, "A jail is no solution." And I was there almost 10 days in front of the jail, and there were so many stories from that, but finally some of the employees who worked in the jail, a few of the deputies, said they would tell the truth if I would protect their identity, and I got 60 minutes in. And they did the piece and called Physicians for Human Rights, and they came in and documented it as torture on the 60-minute piece. And that had never happened in America.
Had you ever heard this before?
No, not in America. And who believes it? And so even after it showed and it aired nationally, they continued. And right on the air they said, "We're going to continue." And then it took more work to stop something so obviously awful and cruel. When I say I've been around, I have been around. After we forced them with an injunction to finally stop the shackling, that's when we had the first of several wrongful deaths in the jail. First one was a father of 5, never arrested, insulin dependent. He begged for 14 hours for his insulin and died a horrible death. We had another death, another. They needed to hurt people. They weren't allowed to shackle anywhere, but they needed to hurt. So anyway, I was always cocky about going to jail, and Phil Berrigan would call getting arrested, I love this, spiritual enema. It is. And I was always like, I had a vocation for jail. And once I was in jail, I'm just a reflection of who I am out here and inside, and with all these women and all these hurting women. I mean, they were no different than me, no different. And I was amazed at what I was learning inside the jails. So when I went to get arrested at Fort Benning, I had a feeling I was going to get some jail time. I just knew it, and got the year. And I asked the judge when I got sentenced, I said I'd like to go to prison like the poor. And because in the federal system you can go home first, and then you report to prison. And they tell you what prison to show up at, and you go on a particular day. And I said I would like to go like the poor, so I left in chains. And I got a year in prison, but it took more than 2 months to get to Texas. And I was all through the South and into New York, Manhattan, and Brooklyn, and New Jersey, and Connecticut. I mean, the things I saw, I called it the scenic route. And there would be 400 of us on a tarmac, chained and shackled, waiting for the next flight, bus, whatever they would put us on, and they took everything from you. I must have been stripped 60 times that year, naked, over and over and over. So I got to Texas. But, I've been around and get there, and I didn't, at first the place looked pretty nice, and it was for sick women. I thought, this is going to be interesting. And I had started a fight with the Bureau of Prisons at Danbury, and I had a pretty recent artificial knee, and so prisons and jails are supposed to comply with the ADA, the American with Disabilities Act, and well, they didn't, and I started this fight, and that's why they shipped me by a Learjet with a woman who had stroked out, who was from my unit, who we tried to get medical help for. And we walked her over to the medical unit, and it was up 2 flights of stairs to get to the medical unit. And even in the middle of winter, and she had chest pains, they told her to go back and rest, and she stroked out really bad. And so they brought her to the hospital. Then they arranged, the Learjet came in, and they got me onto the jet, but they also, on the way, picked up this woman from the hospital who had stroked out, and they had taken her off oxygen or anything yet, but they had to for the airplane. And they said, if she dies while we're flying, we have to land wherever it is she dies. Her name was Joanna. She didn't die. She surprised them all, but she was shackled too. Learjets are very small, but she's shackled. And yet I see her trying to move and get loose. So I knew that, Joanna was going to make it. I mean, she was really paralyzed and all, but she fought. So we got to Texas, and I started seeing a pattern of abuse and neglect. And I started seeing things I couldn't believe. And when I say 14 women died, I mean, it was right in front of me, a lot of them. And I was right on the units, and I saw so many atrocities. And if you got a lump on your breast in the Bureau of Prison, they often tell you it's a pulled muscle. Or they delay treatment for so long, or diagnosis. Once they diagnose you, they have to treat you, so they don't diagnose you. And you're terminal, way terminal, before you even realize it, even though you pretty much know. I've seen a lot, but I've never seen anything this corrupt. And total lack of oversight, but it's a total deliberate indifference. Now, one day I was in my dorm, and a woman who was 78 comes in, 78 years old, into my dorm, never arrested. Her name was Savannah Means from Birmingham, Alabama. And I said, Savannah, why are you here? And she tells me the story, and her kids were involved in drugs, and the feds wanted her to prosecute, to be a witness. And there are all these new drug laws in the federal system now, you know. And so she refused to testify against her grandchildren and children, and she was given a prison sentence. And in all, there were 16 grandmothers in this prison doing 8 to 12 years. This was 8 to 12 for that. 8 to 12 years. Women in wheelchairs, women, and most of them, the vast majority, more than 80% first-time nonviolent offenders. A lot of it is the drug stuff. When I got out of the prison, I went to the Hill, the Capitol, to lobby around healthcare issues in prison. And the head of the Bureau of Prisons had just been there, a woman, and she testified under oath before Congress that they know 3 out of 4 women don't belong in prison. They know this, but now it's the prison industrial complex. It's no longer just prison. There's a woman there too.
Okay.
I'm really carrying on, but
we need for you to just
keep going.
But it's so now I go back and camp out in Texas. I've been back several times, and I have maybe 8 in-depth articles of all the abuse and the dying going on, and nothing gets done. Nothing at all gets done.
This is what she showed me earlier. That's her kid getting out of the prison.
See, and I didn't think until I got in here how, you know, those things connect. Visiting a peace encampment and then going out and doing your own encampment, or never even putting all that together, you know, and what a woman, any woman can do.
And so what's next up on that?
Well, when I got out of prison, this time I was probably, like I said, strip searched more than 60 times. One of my friends is Martin Sheen.
Just the picture.
Yeah.
We're going to take it with us.
One of my friends is Martin Sheen. Now, he came to the prison a few times, and he gets arrested at the School of the Americas. And first time he came to the prison, it was on Mother's Day. And it was wonderful because Mother's Day in a women's prison, if you can imagine. And there's mothers, the grandmothers, my friend, and the children, and you see them with sick and dying, and you know, it's just, it was god-awful. And I could, with Martin, and then the Texas State Representative who was visiting me, Long Berman, and Ralph McLeod, who was head of the Diocese Peace and Justice, these people started coming in. I laid low when I got there, and then I started contacting Amnesty, and once I got the lay of the land, and so all these folks came in with Martin, and we had a visit together, and I pointed out, and it was unbelievable. Then when I was supposed to be released from prison, I had a 1-year sentence, $3,200 fine, and 2 years probation. When it came to release me, they wouldn't release me because I still owed the $3,200 fine. But they knew I was indigent because I was a Catholic worker, and they knew in my records I was indigent. And but they kept me and held me over from my release date. And then they came down from Washington that they were going to hold me for 2 more years because I didn't pay the $3,200 fine, even though it would cost the government close to $100,000 to keep me there. This is how petty they are. So Martin came down and paid me out, and this is when you can see the military in the back. And I'm just coming out of the prison. And so prison work is my passion, but this time I have suffered post-traumatic stress after getting out of the prison this time.
So you weren't willing to, or didn't want to have to stay another 2 years, you wanted?
Well, the problem would be if I stayed in there, I could challenge it, but they moved this prison to Texas, and they moved it to from Kentucky to Texas for a reason. It used to be some of the political prisoners, remember, in Lexington,
Yeah.
and Kathy Bodine. I knew all of those women through the prison system, but they moved it to Texas, and the laws are different. And the appellate court would be New Orleans, very conservative, like I wasn't going to win, and then it would go to the Supreme Court. It was probably a Supreme Court case. However, the Supreme Court has to agree to hear the case, but by the time it would get to the Supreme Court, it would be 2 years and it would be moot. And besides that was they had scared me really bad.
That's what I'm, right.
And they
obviously
had,
it's illegal to do that, but it was too much for you to stay and battle that.
well, they had, once Martin came and once all these people became interested, they started taking me to abandoned areas of the prison and stripping me naked and scaring me. And I didn't get treatment that I needed, but that was nothing compared to what I saw with these women. And so I'm aging, but I have so many problems. But I can't. I would love to go back to jail. I would love to be the old Kathleen, and I'd love to go back and do what I've always loved doing and getting in their face. And I still get in their face, but I'm not getting arrested and going to do prison time. And now I can't even imagine doing prison time because of my physical difficulties. And I just had surgery, and I have 2 artificial knees. I have all this stuff going on, but I know that, you have to be willing to die to go to prison now. You really do.
Yeah.
Are there people taking your place? Are there younger people coming up willing to do that?
This place, it's unbelievable, and I still keep working and trying to get the information out there and keep working, but there are young people, and a lot of young people are aware of prisons and jails now and a lot of the issues. Then they really don't have the first-hand knowledge. It's real different to do prison work from having been outside looking in, but when you've done both, looking inside out, outside in, that makes all the difference in the world. And you see it for what it is, and it's nothing more. Prison used to be prison, and I was in Alderson, West Virginia.
That's what it is.
Is it the privatization of prisons?
It's that, but it's also prison industry. They have you working in there for 8 cents an hour. So when you have a fine and you go to prison, the women with the largest fines get the better jobs because the prison gets a kickback, and they get a kickback of any money they collect toward the fines. They get to keep a percentage of it. So it's all about the money. And if you don't cooperate, you stay in a dorm, you might be on a triple bunk on the top. You get no privileges, you get nothing but, a 20, 30 person dorm. And
were the women you were in with supportive of what you were doing?
Yeah, they were very cute, a lot of them, and I got to know some of the tougher ones because I just loved them. I started because it was just a lot. When you're in prison with women, it's there's a lot of women who appear to be tough, and the men do it too, but they're not, and they're really hurting people. That's all they are, is hurting people who need choices, and they need to have a program in place instead of going to prison. And when our old jail got closed finally, and they built the big new one, it's the largest jail and pretrial facility in all of New York State, built right here in Syracuse for $54 million. We never spent $54 million on anything, but they spent it on the jail, and they said, well, we'll have all these programs. And I said, well, why can't you have programs before you go to jail? That's why we have Guantanamo Bay. That's why we have torture all over the world. And we are responsible, just as responsible, because those prison guards take their cues from Joe Public. And it's our attitudes that I was raised with. We know nothing, and they don't make it easy. And I also told Mother Teresa it's the most neglected work of mercy. And it is. And I don't think the works of mercy are multiple choice. And
are your parents still alive?
No, and it was it was really, I'm smile because I have such empathy for my mother. I've been arrested more than 100 times, but if you would ask me, I would say not enough. You know, and my mother was always very proper, and everything about me was so different from her, and she was like this when it came to me, and I was big, and I was this, and I was that, and I'm an artist, but I drew pictures she hated. She'd say, why can't you draw pretty pictures? You know, and it was so tough for her. And then right after I got arrested at Fort Benning, my stepfather, who was military, retired officer, he had died, and his dying words to me on his deathbed when I went down to see him were, fuck you, right in front of my mother. His dying words to me. And my mother, so nervous, you know, so she wanted me to go on a cruise with her and kind of mend fences. And she just didn't know what to make of me, and I didn't know what to do, you know. So I went on the cruise. I brought all my legal work. And what happened is when we were at Fort Benning, they charged us with a misdemeanor first. And then when we got back home, they charged us with a felony. So my friends went back to the School of the Americas for the next demonstration and got rearrested. I was here in Syracuse, and I was working with the head of the FBI, Michael Mason, because of the jail and the shackling and all this other stuff going on, and he was helping me. So we were waiting for the paperwork from Georgia, and it never came. I went on the cruise with my mom. We get back from going to Cozumel, Mexico, and coming back into port. Early in the morning, the FBI board the ship and lead me off in chains in front of my mother. And she is 77, and she was 77, and I was arguing with the FBI. I was saying, call the FBI here, they'll tell you this is wrongful arrest, blah, blah, blah. They didn't care. They didn't let me take ID, money, my legal papers. And I was fighting with them, and every time they talked, my mother would shake her head in agreement with them. My poor mother. I had great empathy for her, but I got taken off and put in jail and left there for a few days, 3 days before Christmas. And then I was dumped on the streets of Miami, well, Fort Lauderdale, really, and had to find my way home to Syracuse, even though no ID, no money, no anything. And
prior to this dramatic and unfortunate ending to your cruise, was there some healing or resolution with your mom?
It was great, yeah. The resolution was when I got back to Syracuse finally. It was, you know, a little time elapsed, but they did a story on me because I was in the news quite a bit, and I had a parakeet named Chicken Little. And so I get to my apartment, I'm in my jumpsuit, my orange jumpsuit that they released me from the prison to the streets. No underwear, no nothing. Suit barefoot because I couldn't fit in the Cinderella plastic shoes. So I have Fred Flintstone feet. So anyway, I get to the apartment, the photographer comes, and I introduce myself, and I said, this is Chicken Little, and she's the parakeet, I'm the jailbird. And then he clicks the picture, and then so it comes out in the press, and then Mr. Michael Mason has his say, and then they write an editorial in the newspaper here about Kathleen Rumpf and what a horrible thing, and then they put in her poor mother, and my mother loved it because for the first time she
was
got validation. So I have a twin sister and 2 brothers in Louisiana. They all vote for Bush. My whole family, I'm the only one who kind of moved, and they're used to me. I'm not used to them, but they're still my family.
And when did your mom die?
She died 3 years ago. 3 years ago, and I was with her at her deathbed. But you know, it was just
Wow.
well.
What a story.
We're just about out of tape. So is there anything that you didn't say that you want to say?
Well, I feel like it should have been about, you know, the peace encampment, and it is, but it's about our journey as women, and when we get outside our comfort zones and let ourselves do something. And we often say in the Catholic worker movement that, I mean, you do things because it's the right thing to do, and that nobody tells you you have to be successful. God knows you want to be successful, but the only requirement of us as human beings is to be faithful. And so I just think we just need to get out there. Just get in the street and get out there. And stop thinking, what we're going to do next. And Easter time, the Easter before last, for Holy Week, a friend and I, Ilana Levy and I, got out to the federal building for a whole week. We call it urban camping. We've been doing that now. Set up a little tent, really cold, out there a whole week, and there was nobody disagreeing with us about the war. And the mothers who would come to me in tears, please pray for my son, please pray. And there were military agreeing with us. And when you go somewhere, whether it's a cage, whether it's a peace camp, whether it's on the sidewalk, you create a place for people to come and tell their story. And there's, like, in our culture, our stories are stolen from us. Or we're told who and what we are. You're this, you're that, you're no good, So you make a space for people to tell their story. And I think so many stories were told at the Peace Encampment. And it was such a powerful, and it didn't end at that Peace Encampment. You just have to know, better than I, that it continued, and we've still got to continue.